So I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's Battle of Ideas satellite event, which is being hosted by the East Midlands Salon and sponsored by the campaign group Academics for Academic Freedom. And it's the second in a series of 3 on the silencing of speech. My name's Vanessa Pulpavats. And I'll be chairing tonight's talk, which is going to be on Is Toxic Masculinity Dangerous in the Academy? And I'd like to welcome our 2 speakers tonight. Firstly, Elizabeth Hobson, who is Director of Communications at the organisation Justice for Men and Boys, and she's also currently studying for a history degree at the Open University. And then second, I'd like to welcome Nicholas Joseph, who's a parent of 2 girls and a lecturer at the Universities of Derby and Keele, and also a historian. Thank you. So Elizabeth's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then Nicholas is going to respond to her comments.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming, and well done for getting here through the weather. I'll begin. As a non-feminist liberal woman and an individual who values the search for truth as a primary function of universities, I have grave concerns over toxic masculinity in the academy. That is, I have grave concerns over the toxic feminist concept that is toxic masculinity, enabling further entrenchment of feminist aggression that is perverting a key sector of our society. Historically, men have dominated in the public sphere, and they've created the greatest civilization ever known, to the point where we women have been liberated from the private sphere and enabled to contribute to further progress. Men have dedicated their lives to providing technological solutions to women's problems, from sanitary products to labour-saving devices to instruments and procedures to make birth safer and pharmaceuticals to prevent contraception entirely. Men have fought for women's rights and mentored and supported women fighting for the same. Men have broken their backs in support of their families. Men have given their lives for our freedoms. And now men are under attack from gynonormative sycophants who either can't or won't pursue equal opportunities, treatment, or rights for men and boys, and liberal feminist sociopaths who remain a minority of the population at just 9% in the UK according to Fawcett, yet enjoy a disproportionate power to influence the great and the powerful. Men are now a declining minority on campus, at just over 40% of students nationally, and yet all of the special attention and programmes are aimed at women. I study at the Open University, where 59% of students are women. The Open U has a stated belief that discrimination arising from individual characteristics and circumstances is not only unlawful, but a waste of talent and a denial of opportunity, preventing individuals, organisations and societies from achieving their growth potential. Close quote. Eliminating discrimination includes, according to them, ensuring there is no less favourable treatment for people. Close quote. Promoting equality includes encouraging people to participate in public life or in other activities where their participation is disproportionately low. They have committed to increase the proportion of women in senior professorial roles from 27.6% to 40% by 2020, and a Women at OU staff network exists to support them. Women at OU is an all-inclusive group that works to promote gender equality and raise the profile of women at the Open University. The Open University, like many universities, is signed up to the Athena Swan scheme. Athena Swan runs an awards scheme that recognises evidence of increasing numbers of women in senior positions and has been a stipulation for accessing funding for example at the Biomedical Research Centre and the Biomedical Research Unit in 2011, and feminist academics such as Janet Beer, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Liverpool, and Professor Louise Morley of the University of Sussex have called for all research funding to be made conditional on Athena Swan accreditation. The Open University also have a Women at OU committee to support and connect women and signal boost opportunities such as the Aurora Women's Leadership Development Programme. No such commitments, groups or committees exist for men, which leads me to the conclusion that they are failing in their goals of ensuring there is no less favourable treatment for people and encouraging people to participate in activities where their participation is disproportionately low and possibly even discriminating against men. Women nationally have outnumbered men as undergraduates since 1993, and 70% of students are studying subjects in which women dominate. It's not even true to claim that men dominate in STEM subjects. Firstly, there is a sleight of hand wherein medicine is omitted from this list. It should occupy the space of a second M following science, technology, engineering and mathematics. With the addition of medicine, women have outnumbered men in STEM since 2015. But actually, women also dominate in the science category, with their dominance in biology outweighing men in physics. So, women dominate in universities across most subject areas, even in STEM, and there is virtually zero interest in even exploring this matter. I'm not saying that this is evidence of systemic barriers for men, yet alone discrimination, but I do wonder why it's a non-issue, whereas men's dominance in TEM subjects is seen as an abhorrent example of toxic masculinity in action that needs to be addressed. Mary Kernock-Cook, former chief executive of the Universities and Colleges Admission Service, pointed out the very worrying gap between male and female performance at school and university, which she said is leading to fundamental shifts in society. She said that when attempts are made to address men's issues, they are ridiculed and met with the wrath of feminist and gender equality groups. I entirely fail to see the impact of toxic masculinity in all of this. It looks a lot more to me like an excess of toxic feminism. In 1994, feminists Daphne Patai and Noretta Coart wrote in Professing Feminism that women's studies programs have enjoyed the substantive protections afforded by the principle and indeed the reality of academic freedom. It is, in our view, the existence of the essentially liberal value of academic freedom that has allowed women's studies programs to develop in the diverse ways in which we observe them today. But our own experiences and those of many colleagues with whom we spoke have led us to conclude that some programs now deny the very values that allowed them to come into being. If women's studies does not promote, indeed does not stand for, open inquiry, critical exploration of multiple perspectives, even threatening ones, and scholarship not tethered to the political passions of the moment, what is there to be said for its presence in the academy? Close quote. What is there to be said indeed? What is to be said is that 26 years later, we cannot be said to see some women's studies programs denying academic freedom to the faculty and students on those courses. What we see is a whole-scale infiltration of the feminist denial of academic freedom throughout the academy in its entirety. Look at the case of Tim Hunt, a Nobel Prize winner with a history of nurturing his students, women and men alike. In 2015, he was forced to resign from his position as an honorary researcher at University College London and stand down from the Science Committee of the European Research Council after he joked with delegates at a conference in Korea, "Let me tell you about my trouble with girls. 3 things happen when they're in the lab. You fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry." Close quote. Richard Ned Liebau, Professor of International Political Theory at King's College London, was suspended from the International Studies Association, who had previously voted him Distinguished Scholar of the Year in 2018 for another joke. When asked in a crowded lift which floor he wanted, he responded, "Ladies' lingerie," then proceeded to refuse to make a formal apology, one sought in a manner that ran against complaints protocol, by the way. In the same year, Professor Mark Zelinsky of the United States Army War College, a 32-year veteran of the defense intelligence community who has served as a senior counterinsurgency advisor and counterintelligence analyst in the United States and Afghanistan, was also reprimanded by the International Studies Association on 2 counts of misconduct. 1, addressing an email to the women on a forthcoming panel as women, and 2, asking them challenging questions in his role as the discussant at the event itself. Then there's Alessandro Strumia. This year, the theoretical particle physicist was banned from CERN after giving a well-researched presentation at a workshop about gender equality that showed that far from being disadvantaged, women are actually significantly advantaged in physics hiring, promotion, fellowships, and financial assistance. He found that since 1995, women have been being hired, promoted, and offered fellowships and funding with less than half the number of citations of their work than men have when they are hired, promoted, or offered fellowships or funding. He disputed the claim that men avoid citing papers with women's names attached as first authors by showing that both men and women cite papers with male authors first authors more, and suggested that this could possibly be because their findings were more significant. Strumia hypothesized that the reason that men outperform women in this way in physics is not due to bias against women, but because more men than women have the desire and the skills to excel in the field, and that this is because there are more men at the highest end of IQ distribution than there are women. A sensible conclusion based on the evidence, as opposed to the wholly unsupported idea of bias that is generally accepted. When Professor Eric Anderson at Winchester University thought his students would benefit from the insights of Mike Buchanan, leader of Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them, and William Collins, author of The Empathy Gap, an indispensable and authoritative tome on male disadvantage, feminist protests became so intense that the speakers cancelled the event. When Mike Buchanan and I announced that we would be giving talks at Cambridge University, a protest was staged to disrupt a graduation ceremony. An open letter calling on the university to cancel was signed by over 300 students, staff, and alumni. Since the university only partially complied with this demand by moving our location, there was an angry protest outside the event, and attendees and speakers were harassed and assaulted. Feminists are guilty of the most heinous attacks perpetrated against academics personally and vandalism against the academy generally, and either they will be stopped or Janice Fiamengo will be proven right with her 2016 declaration at the International Conference on Men's Issues that the universities are lost to us, close quote. They are, as it stands, all but lost to any reasonable liberal who wants to see them reinstated as truth-seeking institutions. We can discuss bad behaviour, sure, but we should tell the truth and acknowledge the fact that men and women love each other and work fantastically well together the vast majority of the time, and acknowledge the fact that bad behaviour is not gendered. Last February, Lance Welton wrote a provocative piece for VDare.com in which he argued that the masculine dimension to academia, rigorously, unemotionally, and coldly examining facts and arguments, has been wrecked by the increasing presence of emotional and over-empathetic girls, close quote. If we don't rein in our crazy sisters, as Jordan Peterson has called on women to do, It's gonna look for all the world like the man has a point. Not to let men off the hook. As the majority of senior staff, they're consistently prioritising the needs and wants of women over those of men and over the search for the truth. We need a balance. But what we have now is the discounting or even condemnation of very useful masculine features and the emboldening of the very least useful feminine features. And there are not only damaging attitudes to masculinity at universities, where men can and often do choose to opt out. Boys at primary and secondary schools are also struggling. This is a fact increasingly recognised, but there remains an inadequate political will to tackle this problem. In recent years, teachers' assessments have shown girls outperforming boys across reading, writing, science and mathematics. Based on SATs test results, the attainment gap narrows but persists. This may be because girls underperform in tests, or there may be another reason. In 2013, Harley and Sutton discovered that boys over 7 or 8 and girls of all ages rate girls as cleverer and more successful. They also found that the children believed that adults shared this idea. In a separate experiment, 140 of the children were divided into 2 groups. One told that boys do not perform as well as girls, the second not. The children were then tested in maths, reading and writing, and the boys in the first group did significantly worse than the boys in the second. Uzard and Page found in 2012 that women teachers grade boys' work more harshly than that done by girls, and that boys intuited this. They also found greater investment and effort from both boys and girls when they knew that their work would be marked by a male teacher, suggesting that more male teachers would be beneficial to both sexes. In 2013, Cornwell et al. Found again that teachers mark boys down and attributed this to a bias against behavioural characteristics more commonly found in boys than girls. The literature on secondary schools shows the same patterns, of girls being advantaged in teacher-marked assignments, and the gender gap in attainment worsens, then worsens again at A-level. I don't attribute all of the underperformance of boys to an incrementally exacerbated lack of confidence by any means, though I do believe it to be significant. Other factors will of course include natural aptitude, with boys and girls, like men and women, tending to excel and to struggle in different areas. The way we test also comes into play though. At age 16, the gender gap in attainment rose suddenly when O-levels were replaced by GCSEs. And with the Programme for International Student Assessment, which provides a standard by which different nations can compare the effectiveness of their education systems, boys outperform girls. This surely suggests that there are a range of approaches that we could take to supporting boys to achieve in their education, and raises the question, why aren't we? The problem is not toxic masculinity. The problem is that feminists have weaponized our instinctive hypercriticism of men to popularize narratives of male malevolence and to exclude the actual prevalence of male virtue, which aggravates the empathy gap so that male underachievement is accepted as a non-issue, so that men who do achieve academically exist in a precarious position of privilege that can be taken from them for any perceived slight to the sisterhood, so that the search for truth, rigorous empiricism, and excellence are becoming secondary goals to achieving a myopic form of social justice purely for girls and women in the academy. Thank you.
So thank you, Elizabeth. Nicholas.
Right. Okay. We were hoping for a lot of sparks to fly. Well, sadly they didn't invite a social justice warrior to come along and talk to you, so you might be disappointed. When I was asked to come along and be the respondent, I said yes. Well, first job, write up a little biography. Dennis suggested that I should include in this biography something that would be a bit relevant to the subject. And I found it really tricky to write that biography, and it shouldn't have been difficult. You know, it's just a few details about me, who I am, what I do. But it went through several drafts, and what kept going wrong was that they ended up sounding like a Sacha Baron Cohen type parody character. And I wondered why that was happening. And the conclusion I came to, in the end, was that actually there is something fundamentally absurd about the whole gender politics thing. And I was finding it impossible, personally, to engage with it in a serious way. And you know, what is it that's absurd about the whole of gender politics? Well, let's be puerile about it for a moment. We're building a politics fundamentally on knobs and lady parts. Now, you can build a politics on many different paradigms. You know, you can build a politics on a paradigm of human rights, on a paradigm of various economic theories. But to build a politics on knobs and lady parts, well, I just don't see that they will bear that strain. You know, there's a vast political, philosophical edifice being built on these organs, and they're getting squished. It's getting a bit uncomfortable in there. So fundamentally, what I was sensing at least was that gender politics is absurd. And that brings me perhaps to the first point that I'd quite like you to think about and maybe respond to, which is that if you laugh at gender politics, well, you get into trouble. You know? So while the key theme of these Battle of Ideas sessions has been denial of our freedom of speech, perhaps what we've been denied is something much more fundamental, and that is freedom of smirk. You know? Freedom to laugh at absurd pieties. And I think gender politics is perhaps one of these absurd pieties, as are other forms of identity politics. But this leads on to another point. There's an old saying, don't jostle a chimney sweep, because you will get covered in soot. And I just wonder whether you are, in giving so much of your life to opposing people who have an absurd politics, are you aware, are you conscious of the risk that you might become like them? That you might end up mirroring them, becoming similarly absurd, almost, perhaps, in the way that you're approaching things. And I just wonder whether you've thought about that, whether you're consciously taking steps to make sure that you don't end up becoming the mirror image of what you oppose. I wonder whether the way forward here really is to see men as victims of discrimination. You know, are you not in danger of playing the very game that you oppose? Are you not in danger of feeding it, of giving it legitimacy, while instead perhaps a better approach might be to smirk, might be to laugh, might be to blow a raspberry at the whole damn thing? point that point that somebody who emailed in and wanted the respondent to come up with, which I'm going to bring in because this is the point that we reached in my list of things. There was an email about something which you didn't talk about, but I'm just going to raise it very very quickly. Abortion. So I'm conscious that in salons we have done abortion to death in previous meetings, but this correspondent was interested in how far you see abortion as a men's rights issue, and if you do, perhaps you could talk about that a little. Another point that seemed to come out in your talk was about the differences between men and women, boys and girls. And I wonder where you think those differences come from. I mean, are we talking here about differences of genitals on which far too much has been built in this vast intellectual edifice, this vast political edifice, on a mere difference in genitals, or do you think that we have different brains? You know, do you think that I am statistically more likely to be a little brighter than you because because my genitals point in the right direction? Where do you see that coming from? How do you think that fits? Further point. I'm struggling to read my awful handwriting there. but further point. I also wonder how far men are actually to blame here. You know? Does all of this arise ultimately from chivalry? You know? Are we inviting this ourselves? That just seemed to sort of pop into my head as you were talking. Are we actually responsible for this? Is what you're calling toxic feminism kicking at an open door here, which is a traditional open door? You know, so it's perhaps in a sense our fault. I also wonder. And you mentioned in one sentence bad behaviour, and yet the whole idea of toxic masculinity actually arose from, well, bad behaviour by men, or from men, of forms that is linked to a gendered stereotype. And I wonder, you know, do you accept that some men behave badly in ways that accord with that gendered stereotype of the naughty man? And if you do, what do you think is an appropriate way to address that? You know? So perhaps you could talk a little more about that. And how long do I have left? Last point. All right, fine. So, what I wasn't quite sure about, and it would be nice if you could develop, is where do you think this is going? You know, what do you think is the end point? You know, we all going to crash and burn in some horrible way. And what do you want? You know, what do you actually want? If you get what you want, what is that going to look like?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you. So, you can mull on those things.
Oh, okay.
And then we'll gather a few, we'll just gather a few questions, and then we'll, so you get your breath back, think about those, and we'll gather a few questions. So, any questions so far? Any comments?
Yes, I'd like to ask the gentleman the whole thing about building an ideology on lady parts and men's parts. Hey, who did that? Is there an F at the beginning of that word? I think so. It's feminists who've done that for, well, probably actually going back to the French Revolution, to be honest, at the very least. and Elizabeth would argue to the 13th century.
16th.
16th, okay. Because, you know, at the end of the day, this disaster that we face is a disaster created by feminists. And I repeat the point that Elizabeth made, that the Fawcett Society, a radical feminist charity, came up with in 20, you know, they conducted a poll in 2015, reported it in 2016. Only 9% of British women, 1 in 11 today, identify as feminists. Only 4% of British men, 1 in 25 men identify as feminists. But feminists have corrupted every bloody institution in the country, and their influence on all these institutions, government, the public sector, the private sector, just grows relentlessly. And I'm only saying this because, you know, you sort of put out this issue of men's parts and lady parts, as you know, as if we didn't know where the hell that came from. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
So another question. So I think that again that comes to the question of, is it feminism doing it, or actually is it the hollowing out of institutions? I think there was different points there. Another question? Yeah.
I guess is there a bit of a double whammy going on here, where I guess where feminists are attacking the male patriarchal society, that's now become really about men in power, and so it's a very specific type of man in power that is aimed at, which then switches off other men who are not benefiting from that male patriarchal society, so thinking about the working class male potentially. And then this idea of attacking masculine kind of, like the kind of toxic male ideology also being an attack on that traditional male kind of stereotype. So there's a double whammy going on, which is then instantly then divisive. And as soon as we then get into a situation of divisiveness, then it becomes kind of problematic then as to how you can take that forward. You've instantly got conflict, and it doesn't feel then like it's about working together and equality or anything else.
Mm.
So on the one hand, you've got the feminist against patriarchy. On the other hand, you then have an anti-feminist, anti-feminism against matriarchy, and there's a sort of divisiveness in the sort of counter feminism becomes an attack on matriarchy, and we're missing something there. So I think we've got. So we'll come back to. So do you want to respond?
Yeah, so let's start with trying to avoid shaking the chimney sweep. So I think there is a major difference between how feminists approach creating this kind of chimera of female victimhood, which I don't think really exists, to be honest, as opposed to what people in the men's rights movement like myself do, which is pointing out real issues of disadvantage that are genuinely affecting men. And not only do I think there's a difference because feminist issues are non-issues, whereas our issues are real issues, but I also think that there's a difference because there is a degree of sympathy for women that is just not shown to men. And so, you know, if you look, for example, at the incel phenomenon, you know, involuntary celibate people, because it was a term originally developed for disabled people and it was not gendered, but now, you know, we see it as just being men. And, you know, that term is actually used as a slur. People use it on the internet to discredit their opponents, whereas actually, you know, it points to a really significant loss that people have and a hole in their lives. So I think that there is a huge difference. And I think that also there's a difference because in what I do, because I'm very much committed to the liberal values that have made our society so great, whereas feminists are attacking them all the time. Does that work for you? Have I answered your question?
I think you raised.
Or do you want to? You want to
I
raise
raised
more?
few.
Should we go back and forward?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
all right, fine. Can I address that gentleman's point? Hello. What you seem to be saying was the feminists did it. It's the feminists' fault, and I think you're falling into a trap. The trap you're falling into is that instead of playing the ball, you are playing, wait for it, the man. And I think that's a problem. I think you need to be dealing with the issue, and the issue is a bigger issue than just the gender politics issue. It's the whole identity politics problem, which brings me to the lady in green with the red coat and those worries about divisiveness. Absolutely, I think there is a huge upswelling boredom, actually, with this divisive identity politics, of which gender politics is a part, but it's not the whole thing. And we need to be addressing that rather than playing according to the rules of that game, which I think is what we do if we attack these bloody feminists. We need to be attacking the game. We need to be pointing to the absurdity of the game itself, and that involves not playing it. A point that I noted down as you were speaking, feminist issues are non-issues. Men's issues are real issues. Oh dear, I couldn't quite bring myself to assent to that. Again, it sounds like playing their own game back to them. I think it is. Not all is hunky-dory for all women yet. There are genuine women's rights problems that need to be addressed. That is not to the exclusion of addressing men's issues. But I think we need to be...
Yeah, can I jump in?
Of course.
I do think there are a couple of women's rights issues that are important in our society today, and so one of them would be Sharia courts, where women are discriminated against, and our state turns a blind eye, and another one would be their right to hear alternative perspectives on the abortion issue. Which also ties into the free speech thing, and which we'll probably talk about a little bit later. But we're talking tonight specifically about the academy. And in the academy, the feminist issue is that there are not enough women in STEM, which I completely reject. I think that there is absolutely no barriers to women entering technology, engineering, and mathematics. Whereas I think, going back to kind of what I've been talking about, I think my opening statement gave an insight into the fact that men and boys, they're struggling at school, and, they're not going to university at the same rates as women. And isn't that something to be explored? I think that there is likely to be barriers to them achieving.
What kinds of barriers are we talking about?
So we're talking about the kind of cumulative wearing away of their confidence as they're marked down by teachers at school, as they're seen, and encouraged to believe that they are not as clever and not as successful as the girls. You know, in terms of the way we're testing, I talked about how O-levels changing to GCSEs. At that point, we saw the gender attainment gap rise significantly, you know, and indeed there are other forms of testing in which boys outperform girls. And so, yeah, I think that there are a lot of things that we could look into that would potentially even out the situation.
Do you think we're looking here at innate, biologically preconditioned intellectual differences between men and women, boys and girls? Or do you think that we are looking at culturally, culturally generated gender norms in which case, in essence, what you're doing is projecting back the same kinds of theories that feminists have been projected,
I you know, am very much an adherent to the idea that it is a mix of nature and nurture. You know, to answer your question, whether you're statistically more likely to be brighter than me, I would say absolutely, but you're also statistically more likely to be a lot less bright than I am. Because, you know, the bell curve as it is, women cluster in the middle and men cluster at either end.
So let's take some more questions. But again, I think there's I think there's some interesting things though to pick up on some of your earlier talk, like things like Athena Swan, because it's sort of assuming that it's a feminist agenda that is driving things like Athena Swan. But I can tell you, those that are involved in having to do the nightmare paperwork around it do not find it empowering at all. It's an absolute burden, and hardly driven by feminism. I think it's driven by managerialism. It's a very, very different experience for anybody involved in it.
Managers are driven by
so any questions? So who would like to speak out there?
Yeah, sorry, I was saying, didn't you say that the management structure is driven by something? So even if management is failing, you can say that's what it's driven by. So you can say it's failing to achieve its ambitions and it's sort of degenerating into a management culture, but it's driven by something else. So you could criticise what's driving that management and criticise the fact that it's turning into a management disaster. Sorry.
I was wondering, when you're talking about Athena Swan and the Aurora project, whether that actually amounts to positive discrimination and potentially is illegal. The other thought I had, but I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, I just find when I discuss gender issues with students or colleagues, it's always women's issues are structural, we need to address it somehow. But if there is a man's issue, it's an individual issue, so you have to individually deal with it. I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's a question.
Fortunately, I have two boys. And there was this issue I discovered when my first child was in primary 6. I discovered that at a particular period in his primary school, he was coming home with red cards. And in that school, if you have 4 cars, you are out of the school automatically. And he came up with the first one, the second one. So when he came home with the third one, I followed him to the primary school. And when I got there, I discovered that he had 2 teachers. Because one of the things that played against him was because of his gender, and secondly, because he's a black child. So when I got to the school, I saw the head teacher, and they told me that, Mrs. Lamikonra, do you know that statistics prove that male black boys at this certain age, they do have a problem? And because I have worked with intervention program in London for a long time, and I told the head teacher that, do you also know that male black boys always have challenges in school because when they're brilliant, you find them too powerful. Are you struggling because this boy is intelligent and it seems to you that he's more powerful? Do you have a problem in dealing with because he's a guy, he's a boy? And I made my position know that this boy must not be sent out of the school. And that was the end of the red cards. And the same boy that they wanted to send out of the school ended up becoming one of the head boy in one of the secondary school
Well done.
in England. So actually, I could say that sometimes boys at school could be a disadvantage.
Thank you. So, Elizabeth,
Uh,
would you like to
yeah.
answer those?
Yeah. So there's, is positive discrimination illegal? I have a friend called William Stiles from the University of Plymouth. It's Plymouth, right? And he wanted to set up a men's society to complement the women's society. And his NUS refused to allow him to do this. So he wrote to the Equalities Office to clarify whether that was in fact illegal. And their response was essentially that the Equality Act is not meant to apply to men. So, you know, I mean, the wording of the Act itself, positive discrimination probably should be illegal, yes, but in practice it just isn't. And then to the point of women's issues being seen as structural issues and men's being seen as individual. I also have a friend who is studying sociology at a university in Scotland, a man, and he has been sat in his class talking, well, a gender politics class in particular, talking about the issue of rape. And in this class, one young woman put her hand up and said, well, the rape problem would be solved if men would stop being arseholes. There were two tutors in there. The male tutor agreed with her vociferously. My friend then suggested that perhaps rape is not a gendered problem and found himself in pretty swift occurrence in a disciplinary where he was told that other students had felt threatened by his comment that rape was not a gendered problem, and they felt that it, you know, invalidated their experiences. So he explained that when he was a child, he was raped by a woman, and his tutors explained to him that that was a very specific individual experience and it has no bearing on the facts in the wider world. So yes, I think that's absolutely true and a problem that we're facing.
Okay. Yeah, I guess in response to Ruth's point about women's issues being structural and men's being individual, and I don't have a story like that to contribute. But what it put me in mind of was when sometimes I read The Guardian, you know, as I do from time to time, and it dawned on me a while back that it reads like a relic from the 1950s. You know, there is this over-interest, perhaps. I mean, Australia and New Zealand and Canada are very interesting places, but in an international context, perhaps there's over-interest in the old dominions. There's huge interest in cricket. Who on earth cares about cricket? It's like reading a newspaper from the 1950s, and there does seem to be this sense almost that those who are in power now avoid facing up to the fact that they are not revolutionaries, they are actually the establishment, by creating this now utterly false, outdated image of the 1950s, that they see themselves as resisting. Well, you know, those people are dead. That world is finished. You know, but they still manage to create this thought world in which, yes, the structure is as it was. 70 years ago, and it's not, and it's about people who are currently in power not admitting that they are in power.
Have you read The Madness of Crowds by Douglas Murray, everyone? It's an excellent book and I highly recommend it, but he's got an excellent anecdote about that. He kind of likens it to St. George, who, you know, goes around and he kills all of the dragons that there are, and then there are no more dragons, so he ends up, you know, raging around the country trying to find dragons and then eventually just fighting imaginary dragons.
But I just wonder here, though, in terms of some of your comments, are you fighting, I suppose, drawing on some of Nicholas's comments about, you know, a mirror image? Aren't you also recreating a feminist dragon that actually is a displacement of you know, that you're drawing on something that actually isn't where the energies of what you're seeking to oppose actually lie. I mean, it's not feminists that are driving Athena Swan, it is university senior managers that are driving that. It's not the feminists down my corridor that are demanding to do enormous amounts of paperwork to sign up to Athena Swan. It's a top-down thing of funding bodies, research funding bodies, and university league tables that very much concerns senior managers that are driving things like Athena Swan, and it's not the feminists that are doing this. So I think there's an element of creating this sort of straw feminism that you're arguing against, and actually that's not quite how things are working out in practice.
I would like to clarify that, you know, when I talk about feminism, I'm not talking about all feminists. I'm perfectly well aware that there are feminists who genuinely want equal opportunities, treatment, rights, choices for men and women. You know, I know some of them and I read others. However, the feminist movement is absolutely the powerhouse behind projects like Athena Swan. You know, there is a reason why there is, you know, a body who awards universities for getting women into senior management, whereas there isn't one for universities getting men into the student body. And that is because the feminist movement has been extremely successful in lobbying politicians and, you know, powerful bodies that this is the important issue.
At the risk of seeming to gang up on you, which I'm only going to do because we ran the risk a little earlier on of seeming to agree with each other a little too much, I think the point that both Vanessa and I have tried to raise is perhaps this idea, I'm probably putting words into your mouth here, forgive me, Vanessa, this idea that there is a divide and rule game going on. There's a divide and rule game, and you're in danger of playing that game rather than rejecting the game. You know, you're in danger of playing the man not ball. So attacking the feminists rather than facing the game itself,
you seem
and
to
attacking
be,
that divide and rule structure.
Yeah, I mean, I try to attack feminism rather than feminists as individuals. But, you know, if you say there's a divide and rule game being played, then who is this higher power that's pitting feminists against anti-feminists?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Without necessarily having to name people or indulge in conspiracy theory, I think one can point to a wider political structure than simply the gender politics element of identity politics. A wider structure of siloing of interest groups, which serves purposes of control.
Okay.
So,
Are we?
more questions?
I'm going to have a go. Okay. On the Athena Swan, I absolutely hate Athena Swan. I think it just seemed the worst sort of use of what were once progressive ideas about women's equality to serve management objectives. And that's why, and because you present it in that way, it's harder to challenge. Meanwhile, everybody goes on in the canteens and cleaning. The women who get paid no minimum wage or less are totally ignored by universities. Whatabouterism, that wasn't a race issue, but it's just a side issue. But I'd really like to talk about feminism a bit more, because there isn't feminism. I run the Academics for Academic Freedom banned list, and most of the people who got banned recently have actually been feminists of the old school. You know, the old ones you said believe in equality and fight for it. So you should be able to all this. Even recently, the ones who think there are men and boys, have death threats. So there's a serious. That's a different issue why they haven't had. But there is a fight between. You're just talking about the term feminism. Because we had Ella Whelan to talk about what women really want, and she made 3 really good points about new feminism. First of all, it sees women as victims. That's a fundamental. It's not a strike. It celebrates the fact that women are victims. That's the first point. And the second point is, unlike previous feminism, it appeals to the state. It appeals to authorities for solving problems rather than building any sort of movement. And the third thing she made very clear, it hates men. And there is a lot of men hatred around. And that's, it goes in ways, but recently there's been quite a lot of men hatred. So it seems to me that feminism is not just a term you can use easily. It means different things. So a lot of people in universities are the old-fashioned feminists. Now, they don't even know it, but they're TERFs, that would be if they spoke. Trans exclusionary radical feminists. But they'll be denounced for being feminists in the old sense because they believe there are men and women. And that's a serious problem for women. If you talk about things that threaten people in the academy, just go onto Twitter and say there are men and boys and see what happens to you. Your job would be threatened overnight. So there's different sorts of feminism. I think what the new sort of feminism is much more dangerous than probably any other influence in the academy, simply because of the TERF issue. There was everything positive about the old sort of feminism. Who could disagree with that? People should be equal. But something else has happened. So, particularly you, Elizabeth, I'd like to know what your views are on the different sorts of things.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that. So my view is that the new feminism is simply feminism with the mask off, and I would contest Ella Whelan's differentiation between new feminism and old feminism, and suggest that the kind of feminism she's talking about, where women are not victims, where there are not appeals to the state, and where they don't hate men, they've actually always been heretical feminists. So if you look at the likes of Sylvia Pankhurst, she was kicked out of the Women's Social and Political Union, the suffragettes, in part because she supported universal suffrage, which would include the working classes and, working class men as well. If you look, the sort of declaration of sentiments from Seneca Falls, like that is a list of grievances against men. The history of mankind is a history of usurpations on the part of man towards women. It's the mainstream of feminism has always been all of those things, I think, and it's only, I believe that Ella is referring to old school feminists, as like Camille Paglia and people like that. I know she's a fan of hers, and yet, in the 1970s, Gloria Steinem called Camille Paglia the anti-feminist. So that's how I would respond to that. Have you got any response?
I think it would be dangerous for me to respond except very obliquely to Dennis's point that I think it goes back to the removal of our freedom of smirk. You know? There are absurdities here, extreme absurdities in play, and we are not even allowed to smirk at those absurdities.
I think, to that point, I would like to say that, I think the power of smirk is not to be underestimated. And actually, I think that, the BuzzFeed and YouGov poll came out this year, which showed that, there are more people in the UK who have anti-feminist ideas as compared to feminist ideas, like the idea that men are being demonised by feminism. And I think an awful lot of that is down to people on YouTube mocking feminism, and on social media mocking feminism, which is absolutely fantastic. But, on the other hand, I think it's also, incredibly not funny when men are losing jobs and having lives disrupted to a terrible degree in the academy. I think that's something that you can't just laugh off.
Isn't there an aspect to but in terms of you've taken up particular cases, and they in terms of so discussing the academy, you're taking up a particular cases, but isn't there a blurring of different things here? So in terms of the academy, there is casualisation. There are structural issues for both men and women in terms of the casualisation of their conditions. Most junior staff are on work in terms of the younger generation of academics, whether they're male or female. They're on more casualised terms of labour. They have common problems. It's the newer most of them, the newer intake are suffering worsening conditions. I think that's a slightly different issue from issues of freedom of speech in the academy. I think one should disaggregate and separate out these different issues, because they're not the same thing.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. But, the cases that I mentioned, we've got a Nobel Prize winner, a professor of international political theory who'd been voted a Distinguished Scholar of the Year by the ISA, Mark Solinsky, a 32-year veteran of the defence intelligence community. These are not junior
but one could also then cite the Germaine Greers, the prominent feminists who are also...
absolutely. There's problems there too,
have been challenged in terms of freedom of speech in the academy. So isn't there something else going on in terms of... if you, we could have called it, is toxic feminism dangerous in the academy? There's strands of feminism that are now not able to hold meetings in the academy, and so on. Aren't there shared problems in terms of freedom?
There's an all-out assault on freedom of speech from so many angles at the moment that's all tied up with the identity politics. And I don't know whether earlier when you were being quite vague, you might have possibly been referring to the kind of cultural Marxist kind of angle. That idea?
When somebody is being vague, one should not push them on precisely what it is they're vague about.
Fair enough. But I don't think it's a completely, disconnected issue. There are, there's the kind of the arguments over race, the arguments over the trans issues, the arguments over men and women, and the common theme is the assault on the freedom of speech. And what we really need to protect is the right for people to speak and smirk, and to keep their jobs when they have behaved in a manner that's fitting with their position.
The answer that I would give to your point about not being able to laugh things off is this. Yes, undoubtedly, very upsetting, tragic, unjust things happen. I think there is a danger that one can look at those things and lose sight of the absurdity that drives them, you know. And actually, we've got to keep our eyes on the absurdity behind this all, you know.
And not attempt to fight against it.
I think you can do both, but I think there is a danger that you go down the rabbit hole, you know, and fail to engage with what's actually driving the problem.
So, what is driving the problem? I think the last round of questions, and then we'll bring everybody back, and then we can open up for a relaxed discussion.
Sometimes I wonder, because the academy, we are such kind of a minor in population, and most of the things that we come out with, have we ever thought about the effects on the community or the society at large? The effect on the family, the effect on, you know, most of the things that most of the arguments or the theory that we put across. Because I work with a lot of young boys in Britain, and some of these guest rights, what are the effects on the boys? I could see young people, we're raising young people that are growing with fear. The fear of having a normal social relationship with the opposite sex. The fear of, you know, going out with a girl without anything attached, and at the end of the day that person could come back in the next 5 years and accuse them of, he touched me when I was 17 years old. And the fact that you could not even, you know, have a common relationship with opposite sex without the other person not being afraid. And another thing, that the effects on other community within England, when I mean other communities, people with minority group, you know, what are the effects on their culture? What are the effects on religion, the Christian, the Muslim? So most of these arguments we are putting across. Some of I could see a bit of small percentage of people having a lot of wider effects, and sometimes these effects could be very, very negative, and some of these effects are destroying the families that people are trying to bring together.
Any other last? Yeah.
Just on the kind of matter of absurdity, I think we've kind of spoken tonight about, you know, are there differences between men and women? There's one difference that we just haven't touched on at all, and women still have to carry babies, and we haven't really kind of commented on yes, there is a real difference between men and women, and this does cause structural issues in higher education where contracts are casualised, and then there isn't that support should you wish to take time off for maternity, if you haven't got a contract that allows you to take maternity leave, or you haven't got that level of support. And that does seem to be the biggest structural issue that we have, that Athena Swan won't really tackle, and Aurora certainly doesn't tackle those issues. But thankfully our colleagues at UCU really are standing up and now trying to fight that. And so there does seem to be a movement within higher education that is positive, and it is separate to this managerialism around trying to tackle these feminist issues, but it is really tackling the issues that exist.
Yeah, thank you. Right, do you want to make some last? answer the questions, and you're summing up
Okay.
points. So Nicholas and then Elizabeth.
Your point. I'm going to be in danger, I think, of sounding like I agree with you more than I was brought in here to do. But I'm going to run that risk. My chaplain, many years ago when I was at university, he was already a very old man. He was, I think, about 80 at that point. Half Greek, half Irish. You know, it's hardly relevant. But he told me that his mother had said to him when he was still young that if women carry on as they're going to get the men they deserve. And I think certainly your point about some men at least being scared of women has validity, simply from personal experience. I don't know where we go with that. Probably nowhere. Point about men. Your point about women carrying children. Yes, absolutely. I would just offer up the possibility that men also might like to spend a little time with their children. You know, that men also might want to job share. You know, perhaps we should be seeing more of that than we are at the moment.
You stole my lines. Yeah, I think that there is a problem with both young men and young women fearing interacting with each other. You know, young men are fearing false allegations a lot of the time, and young women are fearing being assaulted and raped. And I put, you know, the blame squarely on the shoulders of the same old bogeyman. You know, and then I think there is, for me, you know, when you talked about the breakdown of the family and the assault or the attacks on the family, that is very, very much something that I think is critically important. And, you know, we are signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Article 16.3 states that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and entitled to protection by society and the state. And I think we're completely failing to do that. I think that we should have, you know, a minister for family policy, and I think that we should be giving fathers more paternity leave rights, so that they can bond with mum and baby at that really, you know, critical time. And I think that there should be support available to couples in crisis so that they can, you know, go and try to fix the problems in their relationships before they give up on them. And yeah, I think that about does it. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, everybody. There was lots of things I wanted to argue with, but as chair, I'll argue with you afterwards if there's time. I suppose in terms of sort of final marks and then introducing or just highlighting next time's discussion, where we'll be looking at decolonising the curriculum. I suppose in terms of my, so that's going to be on the 28th of November. I suppose thinking again about the title of tonight's talk is Toxic Masculinity Dangerous in the Academy. I think given some of the concerns that we've raised over some of the forms that certain developments in the academy tonight, we might talk about it. Is there a toxic managerialism that's dangerous in the academy, and the difficult conditions that colleagues have in terms of casualisation of work, and in different ways the problem of the silencing of dissent in all sorts of ways in the academy. So thank you very much, and so thank you to Elizabeth and Nicholas tonight.